Okay, well, welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm extremely delighted to welcome you to this book launch this evening. A book that's entitled Logics of Genocide, Structures of Violence in the Contemporary World, a book that's forthcoming from Routledge Press. Before I go on to introduce our panelists, I'd first like to acknowledge that this event is streaming out from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I myself am located on unceded Musqueam territory. I'd just like to point you to a couple of other events coming up in the next couple of weeks. One that's particularly, I think, relevant to our panel this evening, which is the Grace McInnes Memorial Lecture that will be delivered this year by the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould, the first female Indigenous Attorney General and Justice Minister. And she's going to be speaking on the topic of moving slow while urgent change is needed, why governments struggle to effect true reconciliation. As will become clear, this is a topic that is particularly well paired with our event tonight. And I think I was just talking to the panelists about how I was going to draw upon the book to pose a couple of questions, because what's going to happen is Jody's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then Sven Robinson and myself will engage her in dialogue. So we'll have some questions and hopefully have a little bit of back and forth before we throw it open for audience discussion. And I've managed to cull a couple of questions from the book, which I want to pose to her. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I hope people will join us. I hope the panelists, if they are free, will also join in. I think it's going to be quite a fascinating discussion. Let me now turn to introducing our panelists. First up, we have Martin Schuster, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland, where he also holds a professorship of Judaic Studies and Justice, where he directs the Center for Geographies of Justice. In addition to many articles, he is the author of Autonomy After Auschwitz, Adorno, German Idealism and Modernity, and that came out with University of Press in 2014. New Television, The Aesthetics and Politics of a Genre, and that's University of Chicago Press as well, 2017. And How to Measure a World, A Philosophy of Judaism, which is published just this year, 2021, by Indiana University Press. Then we have Anna Byrne, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Stony Brook University, in addition to several translations of Jean-Luc Nancy, various articles at the intersection of ontology of politics. She is the author of Natality and Finitude, and that came out with Indiana University Press in 2010, and with Hugh Silverman, the editor of Subject and Simulations, and that was with Lexington Books in 2013. And then last but not least, Jill Stauffer, who's Associate Professor and Director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Program at Haverford College. In addition to many articles, she is the author of Ethical Loneliness, The Injustice of Not Being Heard, and the editor with Bettina Bergo of Nietzsche and Levinas, After the Death of a Certain God. Both of those are from Columbia University Press. So I'm now going to just turn it over to the panelists, but I think just a word about, just in a sense, housekeeping issues. Just the format, I think the panelists will each speak for about 10 minutes or so. If they go a little bit over that, that's fine. I'm not going to hold them on too tight a rein. And then I'll start out with a question or two, and then we'll open up for audience discussion. So we're going to have a lot of time for discussion, I think. I encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A section, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. If you're not already familiar with how Zoom works, please do that. And then I'll read them out for the benefit of the recording. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the chat section right now. There's information about the book, and the panelists informed me that the book right now in hardcover is somewhat pricey unless you get a digital version. But in any case, take a look. There's a website that's a Routledge site, and there's a discount code which is HUT20. I'm going to repost that. So if you want to follow up, you certainly can. And hopefully there will be a paperback version very soon, which will be much more affordable. So without any further ado, I'd just like to turn the floor over to Martin Schuster. Martin, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Samir. Thanks for having us, and to the Humanities Institute. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, at least as much pleasure as you can have talking about genocide on Zoom. But I think what I want to do is just say a little bit about the aims of the book and how it came about, and then I'll say a little bit about my own chapter and contribution to the book, and then I'll turn it over to Jill and Anne. And the book grew out of a seminar that Anne and I organized at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, probably almost like a decade ago now, I guess. And there, I think the aim was really to examine, sort of think about genocide in the age of the nation state, and to think about these broader structures that evolve out of the nation state. And as our discussion progressed, I think the topics sort of moved well beyond that in a way. But my own work has continued to sort of focus on that. And I think one way to work our way into the book is there's a couple things that I'm going to post in the chat as I talk. So the thing I've posted right now is Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And I want to draw attention especially to Part B. So B says causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And then you can see there's also talk about conditions of life being such that it brings about physical destruction in whole or in part. And so you can already see that even in the legal codified version of the Genocide Convention, I think it's far broader than we oftentimes tend to think that it is. Now, legally, I think these elements are not applied too frequently, but for people that are interested in thinking about this analytically, I think we should help ourselves to them in a way. And so our book begins, I think, with a basic question: what would it mean to prioritize some of these neglected elements? And the sort of large suggestion, if I can put it very quickly, would be that the study of the perpetration of genocide can benefit from moving to a consideration of the category of the genocidal as opposed to genocide, strictly speaking. And this is essentially a phenomenological point as we conceive it. So I think we tend to think about genocidal violence as something that always has a discrete beginning, middle, and end. But I think doing that sometimes makes it difficult to register certain phenomena. So things like settler colonial genocide, gendered or racialized patterns of violence, or other forms of violence that extend across space or time in complex ways. And our suggestion is that we should focus instead on the form of action, or the form that a genocide might take. Are there certain logics or structures that are genocidal? If so, could they extend across space and time in non-linear ways, even in ways that spill beyond historically limited episodes? And so genocide studies, I think, has oftentimes focused on what we might refer to as the couplet of intention and action. So there's always a desire to seek intentions and pick out particular actions by means of them. And I think this makes sense given the legal context in which genocide is oftentimes invoked, where the idea is oftentimes to persecute or to locate particular perpetrators or victim groups. But for us as scholars, again, interested in studying the phenomena itself, I think focusing on the form might lead to other things. So there are other approaches that could be relevant. Focusing on the form of an action could suggest a genocidal continuum where things can turn out to be genocidal even when there are no explicit genocidal intentions by particular members. So our suggestion is that such a view is not as radical as it may seem. After all, we all already admit that genocide is a highly mediated phenomenon. It's not a natural kind. It requires the coordination of a range of institutions, actors, and elements. And so focusing on the form of action or the logics or structures that can be unearthed through investigation allows us to locate this mediation across broader temporal and spatial terms. And just very quickly to see how this might be the case, I'm going to post another quote in the chat, and this is these are the opening lines of a 1951 document called "We Charge Genocide." It's a paper that William Patterson, the Civil Rights Congress, presented to the United Nations in Paris in 1951, and it exactly highlights the elements of the Genocide Convention that I sort of opened with. So it says, out of the inhuman black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. And so the idea here is that the Civil Rights Congress is bringing together a whole bunch of phenomena that oftentimes are separated temporally, spatially, and sometimes are not put together in certain ways. And the desire is to put them together and to, again, charge genocide. It's not unreasonable, I think, to extend something like this analysis into the present moment with the US's expanded system of mass incarceration. I think other elements could be added to the story involving other targeted victim groups and populations. And again, continuing to the present day in the form of the, for example, rapidly expanding immigration camp system that came to prominence under Trump, but was established earlier and continues to the present day. And the idea is that a lot of discrete phenomena that may or may not be connected by time and space are placed together under one rubric that's understood as genocidal. So elements within the book, I think, pursue an approach like that. And then other chapters in the book, I think, explore particular structures that we might term genocidal. And it's in this vein that I'm going to begin to conclude my comments and just mention very briefly a few thoughts about sort of what I do in my chapter, which aims to sort of locate the state itself as a genocidal structure. And so my argument is not that particular states, say fascist or totalitarian ones, are genocidal, but rather the entire structure itself is genocidal. And here I can just post one more quote. So I'm very much sort of guided by a thought of Theodore W. Adorno's. He says, genocide is the absolute integration, prepared everywhere where people are made the same, polished off, as the German military would say, until they are literally obliterated as deviations from the concept of their full emptiness. And so whether considered internally, as in its own internal workings as a source of power, or externally, as in its external relation to other states in the international arena, I think that the logic of every state is to homogenize its population in particular ways so that the state can function in each of these arenas. And I think this homogenization is always already potentially genocidal. And so putting things in this way, I think, genocide thereby is not the action of a particular kind of state, although of course it is that also, but also a byproduct of the entire state system itself. Now there's a lot more to say here, and I'm happy to discuss more in sort of the discussion, but I'll stop here and turn it over to Anne.
Thanks so much, Martin. It was by accident, really, that we discovered, Martin and I, that we shared an interest in the phenomenon of genocide, and that it was pushing our thinking around in various ways. But previous to that, the intellectual interest that we shared was in the work of Hannah Arendt. And that continues to shape a lot of my efforts to think through this phenomenon of genocide and what it means for political philosophy, generally speaking. So Martin ended on the note of the state and the fact that after all this time, the nation state is something that is still with us. Like, to begin with, I wondered, I spent a lot of time thinking about the sorts of groups that we think of as being susceptible to genocide. And there's a amount of philosophical work out there on that. I mean, what are the characteristics of those groups? Or an attempt to do a kind of an empirical test. I mean, would it count if a number of people from this sort of group were killed? Would that count as genocide? Or do they have to be these sorts of groups? But I think that ends up in a kind of a dead end. And what I found myself thinking instead was what it means to try to give some content to the notion of genus that is built into the word genocide. So Raphael Lemkin invented this word, and he was very self-conscious of wanting to take a Greek word and a Greek syllable and a Latin syllable, so genos coming from the Greek and side coming from Latin, and put them together to make a portmanteau word that he then began to pile meanings onto. And as Martin pointed out, in the course of the UN deliberations, it accumulated further meanings. But what we inherit now at this point in the early 21st century is an accumulation of meanings that remains contested, that what we have available to us is a matter for contestation. So that gives us permission to weigh in and to use the thinking that is available out there already about genocide to push further the thought of how violence operates in political circumstances. So when I found myself thinking about the genos and what that could mean, it directed me towards certain problems that any political institutions face when they seek to perpetuate themselves. So how is it that a political institution, a way of organizing ourselves, makes itself continue over time? And that it typically draws upon a pattern of naturalized self-reproduction. So a genetically related group of people tends to present itself to us as the paradigm, as the typical sort of group that is susceptible to genocidal violence. But as we've seen in the examples that Martin directed our attention to, this isn't the only way of thinking about genocide, and that the genocidal allows us to understand how violence perpetuates itself or is distributed through a political system. So Martin has been interested in the state. I have been interested in democracy, because if we want to find a way of thinking that will deviate from, or that will take us away from thinking about the genus or the genos, then perhaps thinking about the demos will be helpful. And so what I've been trying to argue is that there is a way of thinking about democracy that will force us to, or push us to, try to imagine what an anti-genocidal democracy would look like. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to drive a wedge between democracy and statehood on the one hand, and also between democracy and nationhood on the other. That is to say, to open up a space of thinking within political philosophy where we have to ask the question of who makes up the demos. We have to ask it as a standing, as an ongoing question. And so here the work of Jacques Derrida has been helpful, the notion that democracy is something that is always to come. But I think perhaps even more helpful has been the work of Jacques Rancière, for whom democracy is something that is instituted on the basis of a presumption, above all, of equality. So a democracy, a demos, is made up, is a people made up of whomever. So it is a people that is never created on the basis of an essence or a single specific or specifiable shared characteristic, but rather is the group of whomever. And as a result, the question of how it is we are to live together as a demos is always something open to question. I've been teaching a seminar on the problem of time and democracy. There's at least one student from the seminar in the group here. Hi, Maggie. And in the course of that seminar, I've been forced to shift my thinking because the enemy of the demos that struck me as most worrying was the enemy of neoliberalism. So this comes out of thinking that William Conley and Wendy Brown and Judith Butler pursue. But the students in the seminar are concerned that neoliberalism might not be the enemy, but it might in fact be democracy that's the enemy. So I am particularly interested to hear more from what you've been thinking recently, Jill, about these issues. And those of you in the audience, if you can help me think more about democracy and to figure out if there is any hope for this thing that I would like to call an anti-genocidal democracy.
Hi, everyone. So I'm currently sitting in a large old house in land that settlers call Pennsylvania, but I want to acknowledge that this land is also called Lenapehoking by the Lenni Lenape people, and that Pennsylvania is not a name for all time. So my contribution to the collected volume is, generally speaking, about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the settler colonial state in North America. But more specifically, it's about a Canadian legal case called Delgamuukw v. British Columbia. It would take longer than the time that I've been allotted to give you background on the relationship between the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en First Nations in Western Canada. But I think it's easy for me to link what I wrote to the current political moment because one of my main claims runs as follows. It's not news to anyone that in law courts, bad rulings can result from racism and colonialism. And by bad, I mean unjust or unfair, even when they're legally sound. My paper focuses on how even a good ruling, one that seems to do justice and may even advance the cause of Indigenous peoples, may reinforce a structure of domination rather than challenge it. The most obvious reason why this is true is that the very status of a case as able to be ruled upon by a settler colonial court confirms that the court has jurisdiction over the questions at hand. However, in British Columbia, there are many First Nations who have never ceded their territory nor lost it in battle. And in Canada, the Constitution contains a clause admitting that Indigenous peoples have rights not granted by Canada. So it's not clear why a settler court could assume jurisdiction over a question about land and Indigenous sovereignty rather than have to establish how it got jurisdiction in the first place. Any ruling made in these conditions reinforces a structure of domination because it assumes that the domination has already been accomplished and that we don't need to, and that it's not subject to further question. So that's reason one why law may reinforce a structure of domination rather than challenge it, and it's a general reason. Here's reason two, a reason more specific to the case. In the Delgamuukw case, Indigenous elders told histories that act as forms of jurisdiction within their cultures. Stories, rather than written documents or laws, can convey jurisdiction and something like property rights. The stories are complex and they do not always adhere to settler expectations about how legal evidence or even stories work. Suffice it to say, it's hard for a Western legalist court to hear a story about a bear or about goats that make themselves look like humans as proof of territorial ownership. But if you think about it, what does a citizen of the United States or Canada have to say when asked to describe why she has any right to live on the land where she lives? The answer is always going to be a trick of law. So even if we're not in Canada, as I'm not, and thus do not have a constitution that admits Indigenous peoples have rights that exceed the jurisdiction of that constitution, it shouldn't be that hard to comprehend that when it comes to jurisdiction and ownership of land, what is taken to be settled is not really a settled question. We can and must revisit these things. According to international law, and here it'll be helpful that Martin has already posted part of the Genocide Convention up into the chat for you. Genocide occurs when certain acts are committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Acts that qualify include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Succeeding in genocide is not necessary for it to be a punishable offense. If you have attempted it, or are complicit in it, or have incited it, that counts as crime. I submitted this essay to a volume on genocide because I wanted to make the point that settler colonial law is genocidal, not only in the past, but in the present moment. It works to preserve some lives by rendering other lives disposable. By means of war, law, outlawing of customs and languages, removing children from their homes and forcing them into residential schools, forcing vibrant cultures onto reservations, taking sacred land integral to cultural survival, and cheating indigenous peoples of valuable resources, settlers of North America set out with intent to destroy in whole or in part those who were already here when they arrived. And in the present moment, law continues that work, sometimes even when it's striving to remedy past injustice. We find this logic of the disposability of some lives in our present moment everywhere we look. Black Lives Matter as a demand and a movement is brought into being by a history of Black lives being treated as if they do not matter, as disposable. When it comes to COVID-19, the undervaluation of some lives is reflected in statistics about death and disease rates in Black and Latinx and Native American populations compared to white populations, and points to a history of unequal treatment by and access to healthcare. The most recent former president of the United States regularly reminded us that he's an overt racist. But even without him, we still have legal, correctional, and cultural institutions built and reliant upon white supremacist assumptions. I don't think it's too much to call that genocidal. It's possible to disagree about whether this means that we tear everything down and start over, or what we need to do is significantly modify what we have with a view to justice, equality, and reparation. I'd be fine with that disagreement as long as we could get a majority of people to admit that law is not fully legitimate when it comes to the history of treatment of non-white people. Now, many of us have been through a lot in the past year, so I wanted to find a way to end on a positive note despite the weight of the topic at hand. And so I'll turn briefly to the work of a Black scholar and activist called Adrian Marie Brown, whose main aim is to get people to build movements of solidarity across differing positions of privilege and lack, and to call in rather than to call out, to do the difficult work of creating movements that uplift all involved, even when we're faced with institutions that have not yet shed their alliances with white supremacy. In other words, she aims to help us learn how to face what we're faced with without tearing each other apart. Brown says that if we want to change the world for the better, everything has to change, including us. None of us are already perfectly ready for what's to come. We need to be open to transformation, to conflict, and to recognizing what might be wrong about how we think or what we do, all of us. She wants us to recognize that the line between those who harm and those who are harmed is often blurry, and that most, if not all of us, usually reside on both sides at once, though some are more heavily impacted by harm than others for reasons of unjust history and present practice. To make these points, she calls on transformative justice, which she calls a practice that is, quote, not a futurist theory we are demanding from the larger world, but a practice we are rigorously in with each other as believers, growing the capacity to invite others into, end of quote. Brown asks us to imagine creating spaces that are welcoming and productive, that people run to, and then when those people make a mistake or betray community values, rather than being exiled or canceled, they are brought into conversation about harm and repaired. And as she puts it, quote, if we want to create a world in which conflict and trauma aren't the center of our existence, we have to practice something new, ask different questions, access again our curiosity about each other as a species. And she adds, quote, I want us to feel like we're responsible for each other's transformation. And she also says, quote, I want us to ask who benefits from our hopelessness and to deny our oppressors the satisfaction of getting to see our pain. I want them to wonder how we foment such consistent and deep solidarity and unlearning. I want our infiltrators to be astounded into their own transformations, having failed to tear us apart. End of quote. Now, Adrian Marie Brown is a Black activist writing for Black activists, so I should be careful how I use the word we, because she's not writing directly to me. However, I can read her work and be moved by it and learn a lot from it. And it seems to me that if there's any way to overcome the heavy and widespread logics of genocides, which we all inherit, like it or not, when we're born into this contemporary world, Brown offers us one promising way forward.
Thanks very much to all of you for those wonderful, concise, but yet very rich presentations. I'd just like to encourage members of the audience to avail themselves of the Q&A section and post their questions there. But as I said at the beginning, I'd like to kick things off, and I'd like to try and do that by posing a question for all three panelists to try and address in their own way, and perhaps also if there's, maybe we could take a few minutes if the panelists would like to address one another a bit, but it's up to you. I suppose I've been quite preoccupied more recently with the question of progress. I mean, this is something that, if you work on Adorno, you're inevitably going to be drawn into. This is such a key question, and not just for Adorno, but for German idealism, the question of progress. But it's come up more recently for me because it really is front and center, I think, in Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, where you have just a fascinating constellation of images, sound, text, self-reflection, autobiography, that really, in a way, I would describe it as presenting a very artful depiction of racial capitalism, in a sense that the two main themes running through these episodes is, of course, the project, the catastrophic project of colonizing Africa and the transatlantic slave trade on the one hand, and then also the dispossession of indigenous lands, the westward expansion of the Republic, which itself then fed, fascist imaginaries. I mean, Hitler was very influenced by and impressed by this expansion, and this is what has been called, again, fascism before fascism. Well, what binds this all together? And I think, in a sense, what could be said to bind together the volume, although it's not so explicitly stated, is the justification of colonialism and slave trade in terms of progress, the idea of the so-called white man's burden. And this also ties in very, very much, I think, to the idea of revolution and a certain kind of, and of course the tie of revolution to democracy. So how can we have a democracy that's uncoupled from genocide? And so more specifically, Martin, in your text, you talk about this drive to homogeneity in Hegel and situating the nation state within the modern state system. But it seemed like you weren't really addressing so much in a sense, the justification of violence in Hegel. There's a kind of theodicy, isn't there, of reason, the justification of evil in a providential world, a world in which it's less God's will unfolding than the unfolding of reason itself, right? And of course, this could be said to be a kind of logic that underlies colonialism, right? It's a justification for it. I think that the question of generational being is really interesting because and you're suggesting there that key to genocide is a kind of rupture in a kind of generational continuum, right? I think this is this seems to be what you're arguing. It's fascinating, and it brings to mind the fact that modernity, I mean, one doesn't want to overstate the relationship between modernity and tradition. This is a kind of false binary, but in its own self-understanding, modernity wants to rupture the relationship to the past, right? As Habermas puts it, modernity must generate its normativity out of itself. It wants to make a kind of qualitative break with the past. And in some ways, that is a positive thing. I mean, I think, in a kind of democratic sense, it is important. However, this can lead in many very dangerous directions. The French Revolution of 1789 is a different kind of break from the Haitian Revolution that follows it just by a few years. So it's quite fascinated by that. And then, Jill, I mean, I think your chapter is also really rich and fascinating, and it puts its finger really on the contradiction inherent in law. And more generally, as you in your presentation pointed out, it helps us in a way, or what you'd help us do is recognize the, in a sense, mythological dimension of enlightened progress, right? Because I mean, one of the dimensions that Jill didn't go into in her presentation, but it's there in the chapter, and this really constitutes the core of it, is that that colonial courts have a very narrow definition of evidence and will not countenance, or will very reluctantly countenance, stories and songs and oral tradition more generally, which it dismisses as myth. Yet what you show is the enlightenment, in an authentic way, the enlightened content of myth, which is a kind of relationality to the larger world, and relationality per se, which is key to indigenous traditions, right? But we also then are reminded of the mythological foundation of the so-called enlightened courts, insofar as they're nothing if not based on the myth of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. So there's a kind of dialectic of enlightenment that you're unfolding in that chapter. I think this is really quite brilliant. So I'd be interested to hear, some reflections, if you like, on this question of progress. And I mean, this has come back into the purview as well with Amy Allen's book on the idea of progress, criticizing Habermas and I know this isn't a critical theory panel, but it's also part of the discussion now, isn't it? So yeah, just leave it there. And we also have a question from the audience as well, which we'll come to in a minute. But please, if you'd like to address that.
Martin, did you want to go first, or
should we go in reverse order?
Oh.
You want to do that? It's up to you guys. I wanted.
Well, so yes, I mean, one of the things that happens in the Delgamuukw case, and really in any case where the wish is for Indigenous oral history or stories to be accepted as evidence, is a fight in the court about what evidence is. And then the court deciding that certain types of stories will be heard as evidence after a struggle over it, and then the court patting itself on the back for having done that, but no one in the court actually learning to properly hear the stories for what they are, such that it's a real arrogance to think that you would need training to practice Western law, but you wouldn't need training to hear Indigenous law. And so, as I show in the paper, there are all kinds of really objectionable statements made by the original trial judge, who, had a lot of biases, and just really assumed that he was able to determine what was a fact and what wasn't, and what was valid and what wasn't. And the answer to that always ended up being what was written down in what he recognized as a Western book of history. And anything that didn't made him confused or angry, including one time when an elder wanted to sing a song, not just tell a story, but sing a song. And they spent so much time in court debating whether the song could be sung that by the time the song was sung, they had also determined that it could be sung but not interpreted. And when a story from a culture that has high context, meaning that you can't just hear the story without understanding some other aspects about what the story is embedded in and easily understand it, gets told and then can't be interpreted by someone who's qualified to interpret that, then that's, these are just ways of doing injustice and pretending to have allowed something in while not learning how to hear it, which is just another injustice and kind of goes back to the point I was making about how these are ways in which law kind of accomplishes a kind of domination without acknowledging that that's what it's doing. Wanting to kind of present its own magnanimity or innocence in saying, "Hey, I listened to it all, but but that still didn't prove anything." Yeah. But I should say that that just to be fair, that the Delgamook case, the way that it was decided by the time I got to the Supreme Court, was actually experienced by many Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en people as a positive outcome. A lot of good things did come of it. So when I argue that you see structures of domination within that case, even though it gets celebrated as being a step forward, I am not trying to downplay any of the good things that came of it. I just want to make sure that we don't think only good things came of it.
That's a great question. And it's the one that I keep bumping up against when I think of democracy as being something which was, retrieved out of the Greek miracle, and then in early modern Europe was the emptying out of that space of the monarch or of the divinely appointed ruler. And so what we were left with then was this empty space, as Claude Lefort would put it, that the demos would get to fill, and how that paradoxical structure is the one that I keep trying to revert to. And in a certain sort of way, paradoxes are going to get in the way of progress, because paradoxes are supposed to get resolved so we can move on with this thing already, so we can build, bigger and better and more just democracies, etc. So what I've appreciated is is a general effort, which I see Rancière and to a certain extent Derrida taking up, an effort in radical democratic thinking to tap into the anarchist roots of democracy, that insists that what we have got to rethink constantly is this question of who, of the democracy of whom, that how we decide about who gets included in democracy is always going to be subject to these paradoxical pulls. And I liked the examples that you were thinking through there, Samir, even as you were posing this question. There are ways in which, like, shedding the dead hand of tradition is precisely what has to happen in a democratic revolution, for instance. But there are also ways in which, shedding tradition is precisely the act of injustice. It's the failure to recognize the world as it stands now in the name of progress. So the way that I've been hoping to sort of remain within that problem has been by appealing to this notion of democratic paradox, which several thinkers concentrate on, William Conley, Chantal Mouffe, others, but also to think, to set that alongside something that I'm trying to call the genocide paradox, which is to say we want to avoid genocidal violence, we want to avoid the genocidal, but at the same time, we want to cherish the structures that inform our thinking in terms of groups, nations, communities that are held together by some substantial means.
I don't have that much to add to anything that Jill and Anne said in a way. I mean, I think your question is a really difficult one, Samir. I guess the only thing I might insert into the conversation, I think a lot of my thoughts revolve in very similar registers to I think the things that you quoted from Adrian Murray Brown, Jill, in the sense that I think the couplet for me is really progress and resignation. I mean, the two sort of go hand in hand, because oftentimes, the abandonment of progress, it sort of somehow leads to resignation, and I think that's just as dangerous as asserting, some sort of conception of progress naively or violently or whatever the case might be, and the way that you move between those two is oftentimes looking at what we have in ways that are willing to abandon it, but in ways that don't start with the premise that it must be abandoned. And so it's always a sort of odd movement, I think, between the two. But so much of it, I think, revolves around having this ability and having a sort of, it's almost an emotive stance, a curiosity about ourselves and about the world and about possibilities. And I think also, one thing that we might think about in this context with your question is thinking about it almost in psychoanalytic terms, that that there are currents that make this more and more difficult, and that there are ways in which we defend against doing these sort of things in particular ways, and maybe that we need to develop practices that allow us to move beyond that somehow. But I think it's extremely complex. I don't have anything super worked out, but I think you're absolutely right that progress is sort of in the background here. The only sort of addition I would make to sort of what you say is, I think we all somehow have a sense of, colonialism and it's sort of the underpinning of progress that's there, and the sort of progressive view of history. I mean, all of these things we have somehow decided that, yes, of course, like these are problematic, but so many, as Anne noted, so many of the structures that went along with that, we keep referring to and using, and I think that's what we need to start turning our attention to, because oftentimes I think we focus on these sort of issues that we're very clear about, and forget about some of these other very ordinary sites that are extensions of these earlier sort of logics, I think.
Thanks very much. So I'd like now just to turn to the audience, and we have a couple of questions, which I think you can read as well, but I'm going to read them out again for the benefit of the recording. Thank you so much for your presentations and for this fascinating and challenging book. I'm wondering if you can speak to anti-genocide activism, which has a troubling history of cliche, oversimplification, imperialism. What do you think anti-genocidal activism would look like, and how can the shift to I think, the genocidal refocus political action, if that is even possible? I'm especially interested in the political dimensions of the genocidal that are opened up through the Arendtian thread in the text. So whoever would like to take that on.
Could we hear a bit more about the thought of anti-genocide activism, cliche, oversimplification? What do you have in mind, Adi?
I'm thinking most recently of the Save Darfur movement. That's the example. Thank you, Adi.
I mean, I think this is an extremely difficult question, because even non-cliche, sort of quote, non-cliche genocide activism is oftentimes not effective, in the sense that sometimes it emboldens perpetrators and it actually accelerates genocide. And so the question of where we would be most efficacious and how, I think, is extremely difficult. I don't have a good sense of that, but I think what's opened up possibly by thinking about the genocidal as a category is at least a focus on, again, I think, practices or institutions that we take as ordinary, and sort of understanding that they have genocidal dimensions, whether that will actually translate to, or exactly how it will translate to minimizing the actual perpetration of genocide, I think is a tough question. I don't have a clear sense of it. I don't know if you do, Anne or Jill.
Part of it comes down to, I think, the whole conversation or the activism that revolves around demands for intervention in terms of, you know, sending our troops over there to stop it happening, which is always very difficult, and is always very difficult to disentangle from the notion of needing to export our democracy, or needing to export our way of organizing ourselves. But at the same time, in the face of extreme acts of violence, it's a very understandable desire that surely we can go and fix this. But then again, that produces the same way of thinking that often undergirds interventions that are spurred by humanitarian aid, for instance, that there are things that we have to be very suspicious of, but I don't think we can afford to avoid those conversations, avoid trying to think about what it is that we can do.
Jill, did you want to respond to that?
I don't really think I can add much to it.
Sure. Okay, we have some other questions now. One is from my friend and colleague with the West Coast Alliance Against Racism, Robert Hornsey. And he asks, in the psychology of change, one panelist suggested everything must change. Can genocide ever change, or let's say maybe combated, in a capitalist system that celebrates individualism versus collectivism and profitable exploitation of resources for an individual return of investment versus the sharing of resources for a collective common good? And this is especially, one could say, at issue in the ongoing, cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples on this continent, Australia, New Zealand. Yeah.
Since I think I'm the one who said that everything must change, quoting Adrian Marie Brown, sure, I can address this. So on the one hand, capitalism doesn't want us to change anything about the way individualism slowly destroys solidarity amongst of all kinds. But I think part of what many types of solidarity movements are doing are challenging the idea that that's the only game in town. Sure, it's powerful. Sure, maybe most of us can't even imagine our way out of it at this point. But a lot of people, for instance, if you take someone like Adrian Marie Brown, who's writing about transformative justice from within a community for whom reliance on institutions just doesn't make any sense. You can't call the police. You can't rely on politics to save you. I mean, we don't want this to be true, but it is true for a lot of communities. So what do? You build your own movements. You build solidarity. You take care of your own. Lots of communities have been doing this forever, for always. And they're learning how to do it over and over again because there's so many forces keeping us from sharing our knowledges on these things. But we now have all of these ways of sharing our knowledges on these things, for better and for worse. Social media, as we know, is both can be great and terrible. There are all kinds of ways in which these knowledges get shared now that fight against what is, admittedly relentless about the force of capitalism.
And I think it's stories like that that remind us that that if we are talking about welcoming all the citizens of the democracy, for instance, that people enter the democratic space or enter the public space, if we want to think about it in Arendtian terms, they enter it not shedding their social being at the edge of that space, as Arendt would sometimes seem to want us to do, but rather they enter with very specific historical experiences. And I think the sort of thing that you sketch, Jill, is exactly the sort of thing that that cannot be ignored. The fact that it is possible to live in the heart of a democratic society and yet not have access to any of the institutions that are supposed to support and protect you.
Martin, did you want to respond?
No, I don't have anything to add, I don't think.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And now we have a comment from Alan Whitehorn, and then I will also come to Fawn Plesner's comment as well. Alan Whitehorn was many years ago a J.S. Wordsworth resident scholar, I believe, and was working closely with the Institute. I think this would have been in the 90s, I think, Alan. He's also an expert on the Armenian genocide. So great to have you with us, Alan. And your comment or your question is, the concept of crimes against humanity predates the legal term genocide and has an earlier and wider threshold. It also has been used to prosecute and convict more perpetrators at the ICC. Does your book also use that term?
I believe some of the essays do. You know, I've written the essay that I wrote for the book is part of a larger book that I'm writing. So I actually don't remember whether the parts about crimes against humanity are in the Logics of Genocide book or not. But I agree, Alan, that that crimes against humanity has a wider threshold and is very useful as a tool of law.
Anybody else like to respond? I just did a quick search. Martin, Anne?
What did your search turn up? I mean, I'm pretty sure it appears a few times, but
I think there's something wrong with the search function on my
I mean, I'm 100% certain that it appears. I don't know offhand how many times, but I think yeah, certainly the analytic category of the genocidal, I think, has a huge overlap with that. And so I agree that legally, I think it has a lot more purchase.
That would be the intent of thinking about the genocidal as opposed to genocide, right? So a set of logics as opposed to discrete event. That would seem to open up and widen the purview of the concept, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder, would there be, not maybe for use in a rule of law, or maybe it would take more development, but is there such thing, or could we imagine such thing as a crime against the world? Because there's a way in which, again, drawing on Arendt one more time, how she construes the crime of genocide in the case of Eichmann was the notion that he was taking it upon himself as a Nazi to decide who he would share the world with. And that was a crime against the world. I wonder what talking in those terms adds that isn't captured by the notion of a crime against humanity.
That is really fascinating. I think that would also invite, though, a certain differentiation, because she also, of course, as you know, talks about the de-worlding of the world, brought about via the logic of the social, right? So that would have to be then differentiated to some extent from a more kind of intentional and, let's say, project-oriented, programmatic, let's say, destruction of the world. But I think it would also bring into play the question of modernity and modernizing logics, right? That are very much part of the social, as she she puts it. Anyway, I just a thought about that. So let's come to Fawn. Fawn Plesner. One aspect of this discussion, that is to say, democracy as a non-statist practice in common law and its obvious limitations, is that this reiterates a kind of colonial rhetoric about equality. One glaring fact of being present in Canada is that we live in a space that has a plurality of First Nation and other Indigenous systems of governance, a plurality of Indigenous legal systems that are always ignored. The legal systems do not, I think it's stray from liberal assumptions. First Nations are always ignored and not seen as being able to govern their wider traditional territory, ceded and unceded, in line with their laws. So more of a comment, I think, than a question, but any responses to that? Well,
that is part of what I wanted to, what I do talk about in my larger essay, that the court tends to hear evidence, or hear as evidence what Indigenous elders would put forth as law. So these stories aren't meant to be used as evidence to prove the existence of something. The stories themselves are the existence of that thing. They are the jurisdiction. They are the law, like, to a certain extent. I don't want to equate things too easily. And they ought to be respected and recognized as such. But what I'm trying to show in the essay are all of the ways in which that doesn't happen, even while the court's trying to give itself credit for having been fair.
Thank you. Martin, Anne?
Is it okay if I take up a question that just came in from Rachel Smith also, because I think it's related to what we're talking about right now, and I think in a way...
I was just going to read that out, but if you'd like to do that, why don't you read it?
Yeah, sure. So Rachel says, back to that first question on genocide and the idea of perpetrators, I wonder whether we are including in our minds the Rwandan genocide and the colonial powers, German, Belgian, French, that played boldly their hands, creating, sustaining, and inflaming it, while simultaneously playing savior. To this day, as recent as fall 2020, France laughs in the face of Rwandan inquiries into their role. How do we practically address colonial impact in genocidal and so-called tribal conflicts? And then I think Alan also very helpfully says, crimes against humanity seems global in scope. Ecocide can include a key component of crime against the world. And I think there's a way to... I mean, Arendt's point is fundamentally an ontological one, in the sense that, when you destroy, particularly when you decide certain human beings shouldn't be in the world, it's not that you're just destroying those human beings, you're also destroying the sort of stories they'll tell, the sort of objects they'll produce, the sort of threads that they introduce into the world. In other words, again, it's an ontological point. And so I think, Alan, you're also right to highlight ecocide and sort of impending, climate catastrophe as itself a sort of genocidal structure that we haven't yet mentioned, but that we do need to reckon with. And I think if you put all of these things together, I mean, my sense that there's no easy solutions, but one answer, I think, to sort of Rachel's question and the original question about sort of what we can practically do is, I think it's going to be multifaceted in the sense that human beings are complex creatures. I mean, we have political projects, we have aesthetic projects, I mean, we have social projects, we have ethical projects, and somehow all of these are implicated. And so what I would imagine, I mean, if you take the French case, for example, I mean, there's no way that you can seek purely legal sort of redress here. It's never going to work, I think, first of all. And second of all, it wouldn't be enough, even if you were able to achieve it. I mean, this is sort of Benjaminian point, but it wouldn't bring back the dead. I mean, and so I think you have to seek other things. I mean, you have to produce art. You have to be able to tell stories that bring things to the fore in ways that the legal sort of system prohibits in certain ways and so forth. And so again, this isn't like a blueprint, but there has to be some very expansive conception of what is going to be anti-genocidal work that I think is going to include all of these domains somehow.
And I like, Martin, in what you just said, that you're focusing not only on what do we do after genocide has happened, but how do we live in such a way that we project a world where it won't happen, or we live in such a way that we affirm that it ought not happen. Because the problem with legal rulings is that they're always coming too late. So, we say that we can use law as a form of deterrence against future occurrence, but there isn't a lot of evidence that laws against genocide are deterring people who would undertake those things from doing them. So what types of things, what types of practices, world building can we engage in that will stop us from needing to rely on law after the fact?
I think that's a really interesting way of putting it, a really valuable way of putting it. Because in the shift from genocides to the genocidal, we get out of that concentration or that absorption with the spectacular events, and we also bring it all home in a very detailed and practical way. Contributors to the book talk about immigration in this country, in the United States, and also about practices of incarceration. And just this evening, Jill, you've been speaking about different communities that are part of our world, very much so, very close by, and that are very directly affected by the decisions we make and the choices that we make. I think this often when you begin a conversation with somebody about genocide and make this move, the fear is that we're going to lose the power that the word genocide has. If we start describing imprisonment in genocidal terms, then are we not going to have the word genocide available to us when we really need it for that really dramatic violence? But the violence, the problem with the sort of violences that people in the volume talk about in terms of the genocidal is that they are deeply and broadly and massively harmful. It's just that they happen on the level of what Elizabeth Povinelli calls the often barely perceptible or imperceptible suffering.
Thank you. I'd like to now go to a former student of mine from Sao Paulo, and somebody who's actually translated an essay of mine into Portuguese, Bruno Fiaschetti. Thanks for your presentation. I have a kind of practical question. You pointed out there is an imminent genocidal logic inside our institutions, but do you believe that there are some specific conditions that allow this logic to become something real? I'm Brazilian, and unfortunately our history can be read as a sequence, or in Freudian terms, a repetition of genocides. And even at the present, we can see a genocidal politics running with Bolsonaro in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So trying to summarize it, do you believe that there is some material conditions or specific contexts that make this logic something extremely real? And he apologizes for his English, which is really excellent. So yeah, I mean, one can also think about what's happening in India as a repetition of some of the events in the early mid-1980s, but also, in a sense, the ongoing violence, a tremendous structural violence of caste in that country. To what extent does that, in a sense, allow for the sort of the kind of criminal negligence that we're seeing in that country? But the question really is about Brazil, but India certainly came to mind there. So I'll just open it up.
I think it's a great question. I would say absolutely, but I'm curious to hear from Jill and Anne. I mean, the way I tend to think about this is, I think these genocidal structures are almost nesting in a way. And so you have a very large structure, let's say something like the nation state system. The nation state system, and I think this is, been argued by a lot of different people in different ways, but the nation state system produces things like, for example, nationalism, we're all aware of. But it also produces, I think, racial categories. It produces misogyny and patriarchal categories. And so those are also internal logics that then take on a life of their own. And so even if you were able to, let's say, fix the nation state system, that does not mean that you would then immediately fix these other logics that are now sort of running wild. And so each one of these, I think, has to be addressed and requires particular mechanisms. And so I think the more prominent these things become, then the more likely these broader logics will gain more currency and traction and be more efficacious. And then, of course, I think things like COVID-19, I mean, a pandemic, I think the same thing happened in the US. It was essentially an excuse to do certain forms of ethnic cleansing or genocidal, essentially, outcomes by means of public policy. And so, yeah, I mean, I think certain conditions absolutely make this more likely. But I think that you can, my own sense is that you can nonetheless tease them out in particular ways and show, you know, the nation state produces this sort of logic that then may take on, you know, an independent path. And I think Fanon is very useful for thinking about this. And so that would be how I'd approach this.
Jill, Anne, would you like to respond?
It's a great question, but I don't have anything to add beyond what Mark.
Yeah, it brings us back to the question earlier, as you set it up, Martin, in terms of the operation of various logics. I was thinking of the grinding of a machine, the mechanical operation of various of mechanics of violence, and so we can tune the machine. We can find a way to slow down its operation, or we can take a wrench and stick it right there in the cogs of it. So back to the question of whether we want to tear it all down, grind it all to a halt, or find ways of fine-tuning what it is that we're dealing with.
Thank you. A question from Ian Angus, which I'm just going to come to in just a second. It seems to have disappeared. But before that, I just wanted to read out Alan Whitehorn's further comment with reference to Jeff's comment on multidimensionality. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in many ways are overlapping categories, part of a Venn diagram. In practice, the ICC often prosecuted perpetrators with all three charges. Do you see Ian's question?
I was going to say it's my fault because I typed an answer into it and that made it disappear.
Oh, okay. I see it now. That's fine. Yeah, just also wanted to introduce Ian because he's a longtime member of the Institute's steering committee. And just delighted to have him with us. He retired a couple of years ago, but still very active philosopher. He's got a book coming out on phenomenology and Marxism very shortly. So I'm going to read it again for the recording. Regarding the claim that colonial law must fail to recognize Indigenous law, how would you, Jill, analyze Thomas Berger's Mackenzie pipeline inquiry of the 1970s, which went a long way toward legitimizing Indigenous evidence and law within a Canadian legal procedure? This is an important question insofar as it's timely. Berger died just last week, and so I think there's been a lot of kind of acknowledgement of the sort of key role that he played in this, in the movement towards the recognition of Indigenous title, as problematic and contradictory as that is, as Jill has pointed out already. So, Jill, please.
Yeah, I'm aware of that inquiry only in the way that it gets mentioned in other things that I've looked at, because the essays that I've been writing are focusing on specific rulings and the language of specific rulings from the 80s. So this, Ian, thank you. And what you've done has prompted me to go back to that and look at it more carefully. And so the only thing I want to say is that I'm not saying that colonial law must fail to recognize Indigenous law, only that it often does. A lot of the work that I do, I have the book that I wrote called Ethical Lowliness is about practices of hearing. and the reasons why they often fail. So someone might be trying, a legal institution might be trying to do a good job, trying to listen well and failing. And so part of what's at stake, I think, in the way that I'm thinking about these rulings is what types of practices of hearing are we, embracing, and are they good enough? But thank you, Ian, for the...
I'd just like to add one thing. In 2014, we organized at the Institute quite a major conference called State of Extraction. And we brought together Indigenous frontline land defenders, elders, lawyers, academics, intellectuals, to look at the way in which the character of the Canadian state seemed to be changing and reorienting itself towards, let's say, a double down sort of extractivism. It's not like extractivism is anything new in this country, but it seems to be really doubled down. Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister at the time, said that he wanted to make Canada into a new energy superpower. So the tar sands was really key, and all kinds of conflictual relationships with Indigenous communities were set in motion. And just one speaker that comes to mind now, I mean, there's several really amazing speakers, but Melissa Daniel, who I believe is Dene, talked about how, I mean, her work at Harvard was based on translating Indigenous stories into legal principles and legal terms. And I thought this was really fascinating. So in a sense, the Canadian courts don't really seem to want to come even halfway, but here's an attempt to really, in a sense, do that interpretive work to make the jurisprudence that's inherent. Jurisgenerative, I think the term you used in your chapter is really fascinating. So make the jurisprudence that's implicit more explicit. And that was really a fascinating talk. And I didn't realize how actually important it was until these kinds of discussions. Great. So I think we've got time maybe for one or two more questions if people would like to take one more stab at it. We do have another kind of version from Adi, if I could just read that out. Sort of part of an ongoing dialogue a little bit, rather than simply a discrete question, discrete answers. Activism that is explicitly directed towards combating genocide is often unreflective of the genocidal logics that are necessarily upheld in colonial political systems and institutions, let alone international ones. Part of this, in my view, is due to a lack of substance in the popular conception of genocide, the default being the convention definition, usually no further. I'm wondering how a shift to the genocidal, and especially the political significance of the genocidal in Aaron's paper and in other essays in the volume, calls us to think more deeply about the way that political action can be directed against genocidal practices and logics, and if there is a basis for thinking about activism in this way at all. So take that as a comment or question.
I think part of it is it will be helpful to direct ourselves back to the language of the convention again. As Martin mentioned at the very beginning, there's a lot at work there, some of which gets emphasized more than others. And there's still resources, I think, to be unpacked there that will get us moving towards broader and a more detailed, I would hope, a more paradoxical understanding of what counts as genocide. Martin, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think so, no. I mean,
I'm interested, Adi, when you talk about the lack of substance in the popular conception of genocide. I think this may be, I think maybe what you're thinking of is this concentration on spectacles of violence, and also on a desire to reserve this term genocide for things that happen in places other than here, close to us. And I think that has been a very strong thrust in the volume to renovate our thinking about that, to challenge our thinking about where and how genocide happens.
And our imaginary, I think, too. I mean, so much of genocide studies is dominated by the imaginary of certain genocides. And so, I mean, in a way, I think that could also be an answer to this question about activism. And we need we need lots of different people doing lots of different things that broaden our imaginary in certain ways. So,
thanks, Martin, for earlier bringing up the example of We Charge Genocide from 1951. That language was revived in Chicago in 2013 as an effort to dramatize again the deaths of Black people.
I think that there are some interesting parallels with the discussion today of fascism, insofar as if you look at a number of writers, Enzo Traverso, Hannah Arendt, and of course Raoul Peck brings this up as well in his series, but was first suggested by Aimé Césaire that fascism is really colonialism coming back home, right? It's in a sense the application of colonial forms of domination and violence to Europe itself. So you have that coming back home, but you also, as I said earlier, you have this idea of fascism before fascism in the New World, so quote unquote, the westward expansion of the U.S. Republic. I think this is an interesting constellation to think through alongside of the logics of genocide or the genocidal. So great. So Rachel Smith, I think there's also a societal ignorance on colonialism that fuels this weak perception of genocide. Yes, indeed. I think that's part of the same problem. I'd just like to now put it back to each of you if you have any just final thoughts, just a minute or two, and then we can wrap up. Or not. I mean, you don't have to say anything. But
I was thinking all my thoughts, Samir. I think what's interesting about this discussion that's brought something out for me, at least. I mean, as an academic, I tend not to think so much about sort of activism and actual practical issues, I think, sometimes. And so it was very useful to be forced to do that a little bit. I'm still thinking about that, really.
I guess one thing that I would like to add to the conversation, and thanks to Maggie, who I think is still on the call, from the seminar that we've just finished, comes from the writing of Leanne Simpson, where she talks about internationalism. And diplomacy may be a model that is worth investigating rather than a notion of law. That if we want to find ways of communicating between what I would call genera, between genuses, that the model is not one of subsumption under a democratic or a state or a cosmopolitan umbrella, but rather to establish practices of diplomacy that would make these conversations possible.
Yes, and I think adding to that just always to remember that law is a human invention, and when we let law tell us, when we too easily allow law to tell us that what we have to do is terrible for others. That's our fault. We need to learn how to rethink what it is that our laws are making us do. So, what Mark Rifkin calls settler common sense, we've all been trained to see certain things when we look at land and each other. And that means that we don't see a lot of things that are the truths that are there just looking at us if we just train ourselves to look a little bit differently. These are ways of deeply changing what it feels like to live alongside other people. Just remembering that the land that you think you own, you don't own. That's a trick of law. That's as much of a mythology as what you might think an indigenous tradition is. Remember to just challenge your own practices of hearing and your own practices of seeing. And to me, that is a way to rethink why we humans imagine our way into genocide sometimes.
Well, thanks very much. I think that's a really important note on which to end, because so much of the discussion has been about worlds and world disclosure and destruction of worlds. Thank you very much, Martin and Jill. It's a fascinating book. We've really enjoyed the discussion. I think, Martin, that this is something we do at the Institute. Great. Good to see the volume. We do tend to attract quite a hybrid audience, academics, intellectuals, graduate students, undergraduates, but also activists and politicians. And so I think it's a really interesting force field of ideas and energies.
Yeah, fabulous.
I'd like to thank you very much for being here. I'd like to, of course, thank our audience for such wonderful questions and comments. It's been a very rich discussion, I think. I'd also like to thank our virtual videographer, Evan Gillen, who has been assiduously producing various recordings for us, which are all archived. You find them on our YouTube channel. We've got quite a number of really fascinating talks and panel discussions and conferences and so on. So please avail yourself of those. I've posted in the chat section the forthcoming events that I mentioned. And the last thing I do then is to thank Huyen Pham, who is really the engine room of the Institute. Phenomenal, and gets so many things put together for us, different events and so on. She's really a joy to work with. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again in the not too distant future. Have a good evening.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye. A real pleasure.
Good to see you, Martin and Jill.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.